But we begin with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan.
After a lot of speculation, Pelosi landed on the island today. The trip has put more strain on the relationship between the U.S. and China. Beijing claims Taiwan is part of its own territory, and it is now threatening to retaliate over this visit. Pelosi's Taiwan trip is one part of a larger tour of Asia. She's already made stops in Singapore and Malaysia. Later this week, she will visit Japan and South Korea. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us now from the White House. Nancy, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby was speaking yesterday about tensions with China over this trip. I'd like to play a little clip here.
Put simply, there is no reason for Beijing to turn a potential visit consistent with long-standing U.S. policy into some sort of crisis or conflict. We will not take the bait or engage in saber-rattling. At the same time, we will not be intimidated.
How far is the White House willing to go in response to some type of provocation from China?
Well, that was a really interesting moment that you just played, David, sitting there in the White House briefing yesterday and hearing the National Security Council spokesman kind of go at China and say, look, if you've got a problem with this, if you've got a problem with the House Speaker visiting Taiwan, that's your issue, not ours. And if you do anything to provoke the U.S., that will be on China. It will not be on the United States. He argued that the U.S. policy towards China, towards Taiwan, has not changed, that Speaker Pelosi is far from the first congressional official to visit Taiwan, even this year. But there is a big difference from the Chinese perspective. She is the Speaker of the House. The last time a House Speaker, third in line to the presidency, touched down on Taiwanese soil was 25 years ago when Newt Gingrich went there. So the Chinese view this as a shot across the bow. They view this as an internal issue that the U.S. is meddling in, and they are releasing statements seemingly every 10 to 15 minutes or so, castigating the United States for taking this step, accusing them of gross interference into Chinese internal affairs, and arguing that the U.S. is going to pay the price for undermining China's sovereign security interests. So it's definitely a very unsettled time right now as Speaker Pelosi heads to bed. It's the middle of the night there in Taiwan. And as we watch to see what steps she takes during her visit to Taiwan tomorrow.
And Nancy, yesterday in the briefing, you got the first question in, a good question, of course, and you've covered Congress for many years. So why do you think the Speaker is going ahead with this trip, given all of this talk and all of this controversy?
Well, Debra, she actually laid out her reasons for making this trip in an op-ed that, in an interesting bit of stagecraft, was released by the Washington Post virtually the moment that her plane finally touched down in Taiwan. And in her op-ed, she says, first off, we can't stand by as the Chinese Communist Party proceeds to threaten Taiwan and democracy itself. That is a reference to the fact that China has been making increasingly bellicose statements, stepping up military exercises in the Taiwan Strait, indicating that it would like to take over Taiwan in a more aggressive way. And that's something that clearly concerns the United States and concerns the Taiwanese because they're currently living in a democracy, and they saw what happened in Hong Kong. Beyond that, though, and this is also really notable, you guys, she says that she's taking this trip at a time when the world faces a choice between autocracy and democracy as Russia wages a premeditated and illegal war against Ukraine. So basically what she's saying there is that the U.S. is looking to send a signal to Taiwan that much as the world has viewed the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine as illegitimate, that's the way that the U.S. and many in the world would view any kind of Chinese invasion of Taiwan as well.
Nancy, when I woke up this morning, you had an email that I found kind of fascinating, an internal email where you were telling us basically where the plane was. To the extent that you can say publicly what you said to us in an internal email, walk us through sort of this behind the scenes. Where's the plane going? It just turned due north, all that business.
Right. It's always fun when you can sort of like, turn to your inner Jason Bourne for a couple of hours.
Yeah.
And, and watch as these international missions unfold. Basically, you know, there's been a real cat and mouse game where the House Speaker's office has not officially confirmed that she was even making this trip to Taiwan, but it was highly speculated that she'd be going there today. The Taiwanese were indicating she was going there today. So when the plane, the U.S. military jet, essentially a Boeing 737 that had been carrying the Speaker and her delegation throughout Asia, took off from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia this morning, we were watching to see where's it going to go. And if you were traveling from Kuala Lumpur in a straight line, you'd go for several hours, basically northeast to Taiwan. Instead, the plane was going due east for several hours, sort of leaving all of us guessing, where is this plane actually going? It hadn't filed a flight plan. Nobody really knew. But then suddenly, after about 3 hours, it turned due north. And that's when we had a real concrete sign that it was heading directly to Taiwan. It skirted Philippines airspace and then headed to Taiwan. And the interesting thing about that flight path is that it enabled Speaker Pelosi to avoid the South China Sea, to avoid the Taiwan Strait, and come in from the east, going basically as far away from the Chinese mainland as possible in order to avoid any kind of increased provocation of the Chinese military at a time when we already know they have stepped up their drills, and there's already such a tense situation brewing between the U.S. and China.
Nancy Cordes, fascinating. Thank you, ma'am. For more on this, let's bring in Isaac Stonefish. He is a CBS News contributor and CEO of Strategy Risks, a China-focused research firm. So, Isaac, ahead of Speaker Pelosi's trip, China's foreign minister promised that there would be a response. And he said, quote, "Those who play with fire will perish by it." What actions is China most likely to take now that she went and she's there?
Beijing will likely do things that will raise the temperature in other ways. It's very unlikely that there'll be any sort of stern military response. We don't believe that Beijing wants to start World War III over Pelosi's visit. I think what we'll see is increased hacking against Taiwanese and potentially American assets, increased pressure against Taiwanese and potentially American businesses, and then possibly the arrest and unlawful detention of either Taiwanese or American citizens in China to remind the world that Beijing does have a lot of leverage over the U.S.
You know, Russia's now speaking out, Moscow, warning the U.S. against provoking China with this Taiwan trip. So what's the status of Russia's relationship with China? Could the Kremlin kind of use this as an opportunity to get closer with Beijing?
It might, but I think we have to remember that the Kremlin is also very afraid of Beijing's overreach and doesn't want to be too close to China because that can lead to some very serious loss of strategic autonomy with Moscow. So I think Moscow is doing this as a favor to Beijing. Beijing loves to get other countries to speak out for it, but I wouldn't expect this to be the beginning of some sort of axis really concretely between the two of them against the U.S.
Isaac, last question. Do you think that the U.S., maybe the president, those behind the scenes are kind of thinking this is a little bit of a muscle flex, and does the U.S. come out of this a little bit stronger?
I think so. I think that's a really good way to think about it. And I think if Pelosi had not gone, it would have been a very clear sign of U.S. weakness, U.S. yielding to Beijing over Taiwan. It would have sent a really chilling message to other countries in the world. So I think it's great that she's going, and I think the relationship can be righted from here.
Isaac Stonefish, we thank you.
Yeah, a lot of people feeling that way, too, today. Thank you.